I bring you greetings from our partner in ministry, my partner in ministry, our presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton. And right now we're going to hear from her in the video, and when that's over, you'll hear from me. It's an honor to serve with Elizabeth and with your bishop, but Bishop Smith, I have a profound fear of squirrels. In fact, I've been in counseling for it, so this has been a disturbing assembly. A text from the book of Hebrews, chapter 10, verse 22. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for the one who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So I was fishing with my grandpa in Wisconsin. I was maybe 10. My grandpa was a pastor and a teacher at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. And apropos of nothing, he just looked at me and he said, you know, Stephen, the only death you ever have to be afraid of is already behind you in your baptism. And he went on fishing. What do you do with that? Well, you take it to ground zero, and we'll return to that. But it's about how faith is formed. We are church because we have been formed in our faith by those who've loved us. My father was a church musician, started a Bach cantata series in my home church, and when he brought home the first two records, he told me that I would be crawling around almost pre-speech, and those two records, by the way, were Bach's Magnificat and South Pacific. And so he said that I would all of a sudden just erupt, Fecit potentiam, or ain't that too damn bad? The point is, and maybe for you too, the faith was sung to me before it was taught to me. Songs my grandma sang to my mom. I heard at 3 a.m. my son singing to my granddaughter Sophie. Jesus songs, our faith being formed. We are church. So let's look at a church. Is the power? There it is. The church in Ephesus is a church that we're going to look at, and through that framework, look at what we do together as church around the corner and around the world. The book of Ephesus, the church in Ephesus is mentioned 4 times. The first time is in the book of Acts, and that's church planting. It was a sock. It was a new start. All the residents of Asia, both Jews and Greeks, hear the word of the Lord. It was passionate planting, and that planting turned the world upside down in Ephesus. Second time it's mentioned is in the book of Ephesians, and here's where its life matures. Here's where you get the first ELCA, the first LMM. Here's where their ethics, their doctrine, their form, their first church council meeting, probably their first church council fight. This is when the church got its message, its mojo. It's the first book of faith. Third time it's mentioned is in Timothy, and here we talk about leadership. And so we're going to follow those ideas of a church, what it means to be a church in this report. Paul said to Timothy, I urge you to remain in Ephesus so that you may instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine. The aim of such instruction is love that comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. Later, Paul would remind Timothy of the love songs of his mother and grandmother, Eunice and Lois. Faith formation is always at the heart of church. And then the fourth time it's mentioned It's in the book of Revelation. And here, the writer of Revelation has a quarrel with this church. To the angel of the church of Ephesus write, I know your works, your toil, and your patient enduring. You've tested those who claim to be apostles but are not. You are enduring patiently and bearing up for the sake of my name, but I have this thing against you. You've lost your first love. Repent and do the works you did at first. Calling, as our bishop said, ad fontes, back to that passionate planting, back to that passionate sense of mission. That's why we're here together today. For you see, the first love is God's. For God so loved the world that God has a church, a body in the world. Bonhoeffer said, if the body of Christ is going to be in the world, it ought to take up space. So here is some of that. I don't do PowerPoint often, and I'm going to be about 2 or 3 slides behind the whole time, but if I think about that, I'm going to just not be helpful to you. All right. As our bishop has said, we are church together for the sake of the world. In over 9,300 places, 3.7 million people. And I want to emphasize that God isn't holding out on us. We're a gifted church, gifted by an abundant God. The total offerings of ELCA congregations combined total nearly $1.8 billion in 2015. And I want to give a little bit of the breadth of that flow, because we are a church that is dependent upon one another. And so from the congregations, that money flows about $51 million to synods and about $47 million to church-wide. We're in this together. I think of that first Macedonian offering, that first capital campaign in the new church, where it said first they gave themselves to God and then to us. And then the generosity flowed. We're not a dying church. Our church had 62 babies this past year. And I want to give a shout out to the Mission Investment Fund, which has continued to be an incredible partner for us, both in direct funding and in many other ways in which they are helping us to be a church in mission. We accompanied 80 companion churches around the world, and I want to briefly tell the story of one of them. South Sudan is a new nation. It has gone through agony and 2 civil wars. You might remember a group of refugees from those civil wars called the Lost Boys of Sudan. Those refugees, who were unaccompanied minors, like the folks coming from Central America now, came to this country. They first learned Lutheran in the Lutheran World Federation refugee camps. Then Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services helped resettle them here. Some of them became pastors and have started new starts in the ELCA, Sudanese congregations. Those are the missionaries now going back to their country from each of the tribes that are in the civil war now. And so when we were in Juba, South Sudan, with our 2 missionaries from our ELCA New Starts, and when we met with the director for health of the country of South Sudan, with our hospital in Tanzania, which is going to help do some of the first fistula surgeries, because that war is a war on women, you are there. All of these relationships don't happen by magic, but God is planting a new church that you're a part of, one of the 80 companion churches around the world. The North Carolina Mission Support is sharing in this ministry we're talking about $1 million. We are so incredibly grateful to you. And we see this as love expressed in your generosity. And we thank you. You hearten us as we hearten each other. Well, we're going to have a family reunion in New Orleans, a church-wide assembly. We're going to get the public amen of the church around issues such as the election of a new vice president, a consideration to unify the 3 official lay rosters into one roster of ministry of word and service. We're going to adopt a budget, consider proposals from synod assemblies, discuss declaration on the way with our journey with the Roman Catholic Church, and consider a strategy to accompany unaccompanied minors called amparo, which means in Spanish, refuge. And I'm going to take a little time with this one too, and then the rest will go quickly. At the kitchen table, I learned who I was. It was where I got my culture, my values, where we lit the candles in Advent, sometimes where we fought. Teenage table grace, I thank the Lord for preparing a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. And then one day, my father told our immigration story. He told me about my grandpa, his dad, from the North Sea. They couldn't afford the dike taxes, they couldn't feed their kids. They were cannon fodder for wars of the growing imperialist Germany. They came here for the reason so many people do. The long passage from Bremerhaven to New York, a train ride for 2 days, and at midnight on Saturday night in Clara City, Minnesota, the pastor was there to greet and to welcome my grandpa. The next day in church, after church, the farmers took them, the members, to their first farm, gave them the seed corn for their first harvest. They didn't build a wall. They loved them. They helped them get a start in this world. I have nightmares of my grandparents. We need a new and better conversation about this, one where we can disagree on policy but agree who is our neighbor. The Bible is clear about that. And unless we came via the middle passage of slavery, or we were here already, native, this is our story. These are our grandparents, too. Can we go back to the future? So Rafael, Malpica Padilla, my counterpart in Global Mission, we went to the border. We listened to 25, 30 kids who had tried to cross the borders, and we asked why they left. And every one of them was the same. The violence there is the worst in the world. The killing is pitiless. There's no jobs. There's no hope. Families are dismantling themselves because it's a better bet than if they stayed there for their own kids. I asked the kids where they're going. You know what the 6th most mentioned state was? North Carolina. They are us. Any church which has a commitment that half of its new starts will be in situations of immigration or deep poverty cannot tell people you're welcome to our church, but leave your baggage at the door of your experience here in this country. So Amparo is a way for us, with the Conference of Bishops' blessing and imagination and the Church Council, to help do what we can to make sure that we try and keep families together, that we address the root causes of immigration in countries, that we work towards just and humane policies. We do a program in our office that several synods do. It's called Guardian Angels. So we train people, Bishop Eaton went, where we accompany these kids when they go to court for their hearings. There are things we can all do. ELCA 500th, remembering that the Lutheran Church is a graceful movement within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. What a time to think about and to give thanks for, but to ask, what will the grace-based witness be in the world the next 500 years? God's work, our hands, Sunday. That'll be on September 11th, the 15th anniversary of the attacks in Washington, Pennsylvania, and New York. We're using firefighters to talk about that. We saw the towers fall. The next day, I was at ground zero. And I confess to you that I lost my way. I already knew the faces of people I loved who were buried in that obscene rubble. And then what my grandfather said to me came to me as a gift, that we're all buried already. Do you not know that you've been buried with Christ by baptism unto death? So that as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, you too might walk in newness of life. The fire chief during that time was Dan Nigro, a member of Redeemer Lutheran Church in Bayside, but he was a fire chief because his two superiors were killed. He's just been made the fire chief again. They've coaxed him out of retirement. One of our pastors, a chaplain, firefighter chaplain, ran across the Brooklyn Bridge. What can I do? They said, did you bring your oil? He did. He anointed those firefighters who wanted that baptismal remembrance as they entered the towers. People making their escape on those smoky stairways remembered these brave people doing what they were born and baptized to do with glistening foreheads. It was Jacob's ladder, with angels ascending and descending, and God on both sides of the ladder, bearing us home, bearing with us. Church together. When I met with the Conference of Bishops the first time out in New York in October 2001, they said, what can we do? And all I could think was, can you just come and pray with us? And you did. Your bishop, Leonard, came. Phil came from the staff, pastors and bishops from across the country. The Sunday after Easter, 2002, we worshiped together on Saturday, and then they did God's work, our hands, Sunday the next day, and preached in every one of our congregations, giving us good news. Loved faces. I love my church. My flawed but beautiful church. We could not have done that without all of us, enabling your expression of the church in New York for many years to be a pastor to the metropolis. So, God's work, our hands, Sunday. There's so many conversations in this graceless age that we need to have. Jimmy Carter, in building a habitat house, told us, people think it's about the house, but we live in a world where a person in privilege and a person in poverty never have to be in the same room or the same conversation. We, I believe, are placed in the world to be those places and spaces where the hard conversations can happen, where we can admit together our history, but also allow God to create new space. Brenda Smith, my colleague in New York, said, until we see each other's humanity, we're never going to go anywhere. ELCA votes. What I love about this initiative is that it's networks coming together. Our young adult network, our advocacy network, and our racial justice network have all worked together on this. And so there are tangible things we can do in an election year as church. We have a campaign. This is some of the progress. God is really blessing this campaign. 80 million in current gifts, 17 million in planned gifts, and 159,000 gifts. People who have decided that they are a part of this. And so this gives you an idea of where the funds are going for the campaign. I do want to lift up the malaria ministry, where we've zoomed way past the goal, and I remember sitting in rooms where I heard people say we couldn't do it. Never underestimate God. 62 new congregations. One half of them, as I said, in our strategies and ethnic strategies and poverty. And the other thing you should know about these new ministries is that they're really being done in a lot of different ways. There are churches having churches. There are churches starting second sites. There are churches, as you saw, starting in Orlando, I just heard, in a brewery. You saw a couple of the street ministries. We have a whole network of new starts with people in poverty. Congregational renewal. I believe every congregation is in renewal, or should be. And that when we lose our connection to our communities, that's when we've really lost our first love. And in the way of Jesus, if we have that connection, small can be beautiful. We supported 235 students at ELCA seminaries, 73 young adults in global mission. We've, because of the campaign, been able to open up Cambodia as a place for this ministry and leadership formation. I hope you have a chance to meet some of these new college students, promising young leaders. They're not promising, they're leaders now, today, from 6 different countries. You will have your own part of the campaign, and I think be seeing a video of that later. Your work in Costa Rica, right around the corner from these 3 countries that are sending the unaccompanied migrants, and the same issues are going on there as well. ELCA World Hunger. I just want you to get an idea of the breadth of what God is doing through what we can do together. But I want to get to your synod as we wrap this up. Because you see, you are rediscovering your first love. You have new starts in this synod. You see them there, including some that have been mentioned, the ELCA Episcopal Ministry Together, Holy Trinity, Shepherd of the Hills, Christ in Charlotte, Arbol de Vida. And you have congregations in renewal. These are congregations that are in the renewal program with grants from the ELCA, but I want to announce today that I've just found out that we have received full funding through the campaign for the Leadership School for Mission and Renewal of $50,000. And I look forward to being at that breakfast tomorrow morning, because I think unlocking the power of the laity is the path to the future for our mission. And 2 fast start grants as well, St. Peter's in Southport and Mount Pisgah in Hickory, North Carolina. These are the missionaries that you help make possible and support: young adults in global mission and missionaries. In this synod, you shared $318,000 for ELCA World Hunger, $170,000 in Lutheran disaster response, and you've received grants for $18,800, including Christ Lutheran Church in Charlotte through the McClintock Partners in Education Family Night Outreach Program. Christ Lutheran serves a Tuesday night meal that helped pave a future pathway that breaks the cycle of generational poverty. Often a meal draws members of the community in, and then people can take advantage of classes like Pathways Out of Poverty to begin building a plan for greater stability for their family. Here's what one member says: "Our greatest success is seeing participating families become more stable and their children on a pathway to future success that will enable them to break free from general poverty. One student involved in Aviation Club is now a first-generation college student studying aviation science. God renews people through renewed congregations." And coming down the home stretch, and this time I mean it. When I asked how much time I had, I thought I had more time, so I'd planned a 50-minute mime on the book of Leviticus, but I can't do it. Your first love. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that lived first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. I remind you to rekindle the gift that God is within you. For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. I've been thinking a lot of this Caravaggio picture of Paul on the road to Damascus. You see that he's sprawled in the dust. He's absolutely vulnerable. The poor horse is trying not to step on him. He really believed that he saw the risen Lord. This was his resurrection experience. And he was so stunned by the resurrection of Jesus from the dead that he never got over it. If that isn't us, our churches, our synods, our congregations, our leaders sprawled and stunned and vulnerable to the resurrection power of Jesus from the dead, we're not going anywhere. But what isn't possible if we stand by an empty tomb? My grandma, who sang me love songs, the last time I saw her was in the Altenheim in St. Louis, and she was beginning to forget. So I walked in, and she looked up, and she looked at me, and she said, "I think you belong to me." And then she called out my name. It is a holy thing to be remembered. Grandma, the body of Christ for you. Grandma, the blood of Christ for you. The next time we are church at the table, remember how crowded that altar is. My grandma is there. And those people buried that beautiful day in September. And all of the living, all of us, we're going to be together every time we're at the table. We say it, don't we? With angels and archangels and all the company of heaven in every time and every place. We are church. Thank you.